أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to an iSyllabus live discussion. Today I have Sh Ruzwan with me and we are discussing about the forthcoming topic that the Sheikh is teaching over a period of a couple of weeks. As you all know, Sh Ruzwan lately has been focusing on more subjects and has been looking at subjects a bit more in detail. So this one, it's a very interesting topic, a very relevant topic, a topic that affects actually most people, perhaps, at least in the Western world, the Muslims in the Western world. So inshallah, discussion will be around the topic of Islam engendering change when ideology, theology, and biology collide. So that's the topic of the course, inshallah. And it's starting on the 22nd of January. It's a 4-week course, and the Sheikh is going to go into detail. So today's live discussion is really about what the course is about, why the Sheikh thinks it's important to speak about it, and what's the kind of content and material we'll be looking at. So if you want to enroll on the course, go onto the iSyllabus website and you can enroll for it. So Jazakallah khair again for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Sheikh. How are you?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan. Thank you for hosting this this preview of this upcoming attempt to cover quite a important topic. I mean, I think I bit more than I can chew on this one, but inshallah, looking forward to it.
MashaAllah. Okay, so my first question is, Sheikh, when did you think, I mean, obviously a lot of Muslims have been thinking about this for the last couple of years with a lot of what's happened, actually, especially in the UK. When did you kind of think about this topic in the way that it should be discussed academically, but without kind of clickbaiting that we see? So yeah, when did you kind of think about it?
Well, to be honest, when I was studying, it was still at the back of my mind. When I used to study in traditional settings in the Middle East, I always used to kind of have the back of my mind issues that were of relevance, you know, in the kind of context within which I was brought up in Glasgow, in Scotland, knowing people in the UK, in America. And you know that this, especially in terms of popular culture, in terms of the way that gender is projected, sexuality is projected, it interfaces with so many different issues to do with delinquency, to do with you know, how people view themselves, how they interact. But also for Muslims, in terms of gender interactions, was a kind of bread and butter discussion and question. You probably know, you know, is there gender segregation in Islam? You know, this is a big issue that's preoccupied Muslims generally. I think young people, especially in university. So when I used to come back from studying, you know, one of the main kind of topics people would want to know about was gender interaction between males and females. And that was a simple kind of innocent kind of discussion. But obviously, you know, having spent time speaking with people, counseling people, you do realize that there is a deep need for, you know, kind of some kind of intervention from scholars in this issue, because you do meet people. And I remember once I spent 4 hours with somebody who was having same-sex urges, and somebody very prominent actually. So it was interesting that the person hadn't gone public, but for some reason it was the only public event I've actually attended. It was like a nationwide event. And it was strange that in that one event that I've attended, where it's a nationwide event where there's lots of people speaking, I was approached and I was speaking to this person for 4 hours. You understand the intricacy and the delicacy of the question itself, because it interfaces with theology, our religious tenets, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And at the forefront of it was for me to be authentic to the studies and the teachings that I'd inherited. And obviously Sheikh Aslam, you know, we did a talk on this in Birmingham, and yourself as well, Sheikh Hassan. You'll know that what we inherit is a legacy And you're trying to make sense of whether the legacy that you inherited from your own teachers makes sense in the context of these kind of problems and complexities that we face in the modern world. And this is 15 years ago. Now, fast forward to today, it is much more complex. It is much more, difficult to have a black and white understanding of certain things. But I would say that, thinking about that over that period of time, speaking with young people, it meant that I think it was something that had to be presented to the Muslim community, because I think the Muslim community is quite black and white on these issues, not in terms of the Islamic rulings on these topics, but in terms of how to engage with them. And that came to a head with the RSE, the kind of religious sex education issues in Birmingham and England, where there was kind of opposition to certain programs being taught in primary schools of all places. The responses to that were kind of hijacked by kind of extremist Muslims as well. I mean, external to the schools, as you know. And so what I found strange and shocking and quite scary for me is that the lack of scholars speaking in depth about this topic, given that I think it is the interface of the most serious challenge to Islam in this day and age, for so many different reasons. I mean, political, theological, religious. It is such an important issue, regardless of where you view yourself. If you view yourself as a nominal Muslim who's just a political or ideological or ethnic Muslim, for example, it's still a very important topic, because it relates to minority status and the rights that you have as a minority. If you're interested in terms of your religious persuasion, it's very important, because there's certain things you can't even say in public. And so, part of the reason why I came to put this course together was, first of all, this kind of shock element that I felt, why are scholars not talking about it in detail? And I know this for a fact, because scholars will not talk about it. There was events. There was an event in Birmingham, and many of the scholars I thought would have spoken there pulled out. And I came all the way from Scotland to speak at it, and I was saying, well, where's everyone else who's local? And they said, well, they made excuses. And I thought, wow, is this how serious it's got? And I think, just from my own kind of upbringing, I don't think I'm going to just remain silent on these kind of topics. I think you need to make your position very clear, not for yourself, but for the community. And I think that's probably what led me to the course itself.
So a couple of things there. The idea scholars have a duty, not only to speak, but speak in a way in which we can articulate our inherited legacy and kind of respond to these challenges. Okay, so over the 15 years, there's a lot of ground that's been covered, I suppose, on this issue. So one of the, and it's interesting we're talking about that, because you've almost brought kind of 2-3 things together, which essentially allows us to really explore this. So you mentioned when ideology, theology, and biology collide. Now, firstly, why the need of all three? I suppose, why not just ideology and theology? I mean, do you feel that it has, all of this kind of ground has to be covered in order to talk about kind of the issue at hand?
Yeah, I think that the title, I was thinking about the course. I thought, yeah, let's do a course about gender and sexuality in terms of its kind of orientations and persuasions and kind of inclinations. But then the title I came up with was Islam Engendering Change, because part of it is this move to, obviously we know that Islam's trying to be reformed. People are trying to reform Islam, and there's calls to reform Islam as if it's the panacea for all our ills. So change Islam. Okay. Engendering change, meaning that the issue of gender, I've kind of had a play on words there. The issue of gender is I think the vehicle through which we'll be pushed like in no other place to change the basic principles of our faith. And the reason why I kind of came up with where biology, ideology, and theology collide is because, yes, theology, there's a specific viewpoint amongst traditional conservative Muslims, mainstream Muslims, even conservative mainstream Muslims, about same-sex acts and just gender issues in general. And also part of that is normative readings of the text, which some people would say would be patriarchal, or some even would actually posit it to be misogynistic, anti-feminine. There's the tradition, there's a kind of theology there, but there's also the ideology, and the ideology is important because at the core of this is an attack from the liberal West against Islam. And I think this, if in the Muslim world, if you look at it, the way that the West justifies, for example, going into Afghanistan or going into Iraq or going to Muslim countries, and this has been well documented, is the fact that they want to save Muslim women. And so this is the outer skin, I think, of a very deep ideological attack on Islam. And so there is a very clear ideological strand within the discussion about gender. And it comes from, European history. Montesquieu in the 18th century was one of the first people that talked about Islam being, the kind of representative of misogyny and anti-Western values. He's French, and you probably know that the French female was granted the right to vote and own property in the middle of the last century. And so you're thinking, well, he's probably missed a bit of history there. But the interesting thing is ideology is very, very important. And biology is important as well. Why? Because, we're living still at we're talking about the time when we're speaking of this pandemic of COVID moving into almost like an endemic. And so remember, you all know science, follow the science. You've heard this phrase before. Let's follow the science, not the politics, not the kind of economic discussions about what we should do in terms of lockdown. Let's follow the science. And unfortunately, and this is shocking and strange in equal measure, when you talk about gender and you talk about these issues, science is not going to be at the forefront of your mind at all. The biology is not going to be important. It's the ideology that dictates what the biology says. And the reason for that is that you'll have studies, meta-studies, peer-reviewed studies on topics about same-sex attraction, this idea of the gay gene. You'll have discussions about or studies done about all these topics from extensive, stringent academic, scientific backgrounds, and they'll be rejected on the basis of ideology. And so it is a situation where you have the theology, which is the Islamic theology, but I would say Catholic theology as well. You have the ideology, which is kind of this muscular liberalism, which is, very much part of Western society, and the biology, which is essentially the forfeiting of biology and the seconding of biology in favor of ideology. All these things collide to make this perfect storm. And unfortunately, in equal measure, Islam is the kind of the one religion that says, okay, we have a theology which we will defend, and we have religious positions that we will defend. You talk about the English Church, you talk about the Church of England, you talk about the Catholic Church in England. Their one and only attempt to kind of stand up for their tradition has been kind of jettisoned and left, to the point that they will not now defend the fact that marriage is between a male and a female. I think it was the Archbishop of Canterbury who I think he was asked about this recently. There was a case where there was a clergyman dismissed from a teaching position post for simply saying that marriage is a sacrament between a male and a female, and he was I think he was sacked, and it was brought to the attention of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he refused to comment on that, even though it was on their website that marriage is essentially between a man and a woman. And if you have a situation like that, it's Muslims and Islam that really stands as this kind of, this kind of other outside of mainstream society, which is saying, no, I'm sorry, but biology is important. Science is important. How ironic is that Islam is now saying, like, let's follow the science on this topic? This is how bad it's become. It's become something where the science and the biology is not important. What's important is the ideology that reads the science. And I think because of that, and because the ideology, and because of the fact that, you know, in the West, you know, if you want to become a citizen of the Netherlands, for example, and you're from a Muslim country, in other words, you're a kind of refugee or something, you will have to watch two gay men kissing to be able to be granted citizenship. Now, if you come from New Zealand, or you come from Canada or America, and you want to gain the same citizenship, you will not have to do that. And so there's ideology. And who is it targeted against? It's targeted against Muslims. And so within this mess, you have to not just decide to reciprocate with madness, but you have to address the topic in a calm, collected way and understand all the various elements in this topic, which is why this discussion, which, you know, the course I'm doing, is covering, you know, not just, you know, same-sex marriage and things like that are just part of a small part, in fact, of the course, because the course is about gender and feminism. It's about feminist readings of the Quran. It's about this idea that Islam is a misogynistic religion, you know, based upon, you know, well-known things about inheritance, about, you know, female rights in Islam, you know, the fact that can a woman become an imam or something. You know, these are all topics that are, you know, things that Muslims just discuss, you know, and when a young girl becomes the age where she will, you know, go through a monthly cycle, she will ask, why can I not go to the mosque at a certain time, or why can I not pray, and why can I not fast? And so superficially, you would imagine, well, that's indicative of being misogynistic as a religion. But, you know, I think we do need to kind of open that up as well a bit.
Okay. So you mentioned a few things that are interesting. One is obviously about biology, the fact that it's been kind of pushed back, and we've got this pseudoscience as long as the biology kind of agrees with the ideology. I mean, one of the questions, I suppose, that comes up now for people from the LGBT community is that gender is no longer should be framed through biology, rather it should be psychology. So this idea is not, you know, what I'm born with; it's how I feel. I think BBC Radio 4, I was listening to an interesting topic about whole idea of people who have transgenders kind of taking part in Olympics and swimming, you know, some of this kind of stuff that's come up now. I mean, the lady was very clear. She said it's not biology, although she was challenged to the fact that, you know, there is biological advantages, obviously, that we cannot take out. But simply, they said they almost want to throw biology out and kind of replace it with psychology. So I wonder what your kind of understanding of that would be, Sh.
I mean, the thing here is it's extremely complicated, and the part of the reason for the course is to kind of step by step unpack the complexity to make it simple, because you have the LGBTQ, so you have all these letters. All these letters make up what was understood to be an umbrella, but the umbrella is almost like a rainbow. The rainbow is in and of itself consistent of very contrasting and conflicting strands. So you'll know that the feminist movement and certain strands of the feminist movement are now, at loggerheads with the transgender movement, because of the fact that, you know, there's different waves of feminism. There's a first wave, second wave. What was achieved by the second wave of feminism now is being taken away by this, you know, this demand from the transgender community to have access to what the females claim that they achieved in that wave. And so you've got loggerheads everywhere. So the LGB is very much about orientation. And the transgender movement is more about choice. It's more about identity. So this is slightly different from this kind of biological urge, because there's the thing here is there's lots of paradoxes that come out when you talk about the biology is saying one thing, and then you know the psychology is something else, and the volition and choice of people is saying something else. So people identify as, you know, you're a man, you've got a beard, but you now identify as a woman, for example. That's a transgender woman, you know, and so there's this kind of paradox everywhere you look within the community, regardless of being a Muslim or not, just looking at that instance of variation leads you to the point that, you have to touch home, and discuss what are the criteria based upon which you decide what is right and true. But let's leave aside what's right, because that's going to religious territory. What's true and what's real. And so, on the one hand, you have people that are, say, for example, just homosexual, and they will say, well, our propensity to homosexuality is based upon a biological genetic factor. And so there's a gay gene. And we know 2019, there was the largest study conducted on this, saying, and this is from professors from MIT University, I think over if I don't mention the wrong figures, 500,000 genomes were studied, came up with the conclusion that, under 25% of tendencies towards same-sex attraction can be in some way related to genetic factors. All the rest are to do with volition, choice, nurture, upbringing. And so there's no such thing as a gay gene. Now that goes against everything that we're told, because you probably know Jeremy Corbyn. I remember this. I'm sure with Jeremy Corbyn, he went to an event for the LGBT community and he congratulated them at their success and their lobbying. And he said something about, he congratulates them on their choice. And the next day, I don't know if you remember, about this or remember this, there was a Twitter storm against him saying, sorry, Corbyn, it's not a choice. We were born this way. And I'm sure that was before 2019. It may not have been, but the science says something completely different. And so the thing is, ideology there is important. But with the transgender movement, there is, this is where I think Muslims become slightly kind of slanted in their understanding. There are very serious, deep-rooted issues here that we need to understand and accept, which is there are what we call dysphoria amongst certain people about their identity, and that previously was understood to be some kind of mental imbalance. There was kind of interference in their ability to think and to choose about what their gender role actually was. And I think there is a very rich discussion, which I'm going to be talking about in the course, about whether we inherently have dispositions or not, which is called in Arabic taba'. Imam Junaid al-Baghdadi said that a person is not responsible for their taba', but they're responsible for what they act, which is act from what is in their taba'. For you, for example, you might be prone to anger. You're not judged on the fact that you've got this propensity towards anger. You're judged on the propensity of how you use it. And the Prophet ﷺ also, he spoke to one of the companions who came to him and he did something. And the Prophet said, you've been given two qualities that are beloved to God and the Messenger. And the companion, when he heard that, he asked, is it something inbuilt? Is it taba'? Is it something that is within, is it something inherent within me? Like I'm prone to it without me knowing it and choosing it? Or is it something that, I've chosen? And the Prophet said, God has given you, it's inherent. So we do believe there's certain inherent qualities that you cannot change. And part of that is whether it's to do with the gestation period within the womb, whether it's to do with, these are unfortunate issues to discuss, but whether it's to do with molestation and some kind of event in early childhood which took place. This is well documented. Again, this is well documented. The cases of molestation and child abuse, which then come up in individuals who now have same-sex tendencies. The only discussion that's in the scientific literature here, again, peer-reviewed scientific literature, which is accepted, is whether it's causal or not. In other words, whether the kind of abuse causes these kind of tendencies or whether it made them prone to being abused in the first place. And so, as a Muslim theologian, I wouldn't have any opinion on that because of the simple fact that it is very, very plausible that people have tendencies which they're told not to act upon. And so I think this issue is important for Muslims, parents, siblings, It's important for imams, because your congregation will come to you with these types of questions, and you need to be a bit more aware of the kind of engineering behind this whole discussion. And so you're not saying to people, just you have these same-sex tendencies, just say astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, and that's it, or just fast. You'll meet people, and I know many people in that situation who've been told that, and it makes no difference, because these are deep-rooted issues. That unfortunately, deep-rooted issues don't always lead to a conclusion. We know this for a fact. You'll know people that have problems of all sorts, and there's no way of coming to the some kind of definite closure to it. But the whole point is that part of the discussion is that you need to at least address it, and to take steps to mitigate it and to lessen the kind of difficulties that people go through.
Okay. So that's interesting. You talked about the gay gene and how the biology there didn't necessarily fit in with the ideology. Theology is interesting. You mentioned about Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, which is interesting for me because he's from a more evangelical background. And the idea was to take a more tougher stance on ethics. There's a recent Facebook post where he did one of the African countries where he said, you parliamentarians must be careful against your anti-LGBT laws. But what's more interesting with the response I was reading from a lot of the African Christians saying that, you've left the Bible. This is ethical colonialism, So there seems to be a disconnect between the Christian theologians, at least, who are in the highest seats, and between kind of the general Christians who have a clear understanding of the theology. And I suppose you can understand why Welby's done that, because many people in the West, like you mentioned, Sheikh, have to be very careful now in our jobs of what we say. And that connects back to ideology. When it comes to ideology, who do you think, who are the people pushing this? We know, there is politicians, and I follow a lot of Muslim politicians who are generally kind of towards the left, but they feel there's a strong support that they have to give to these type of movements, feminists, LGBTQ, or anyone, because they're minorities, we are minorities, we kind of stick up for each other. So what other factors, I know you're going to discuss it in more detail, and what factors are pushing this ideology almost, and you mentioned this idea of identity, that if you want to be liberal, you need to hang on to these certain values and get them kind of ticked off. So as a Muslim, you campaign for women's rights, you are pro-LGBT, and this is what we expect from you. Almost the left want to mold you in a way that for you to be actually accepted. So more on the ideology part, which is quite interesting.
I don't think it is necessarily people of those persuasions. If you're just talking, the course is about theology, feminism, commentary of the Quran from a feminist perspective. This issue of LGBT is actually, I think, 1/5 of the course, so you don't want to stress too much on it. But the thing about who's pushing the agenda, I think it's generally progressives. It's not even people from the LGBT community. Okay. And this is something actually I've been thinking about quite a lot. There are people, and there was mechanisms through which people with same-sex urges within Muslim communities just existed and flourished in certain ways. There's obvious legal Shari'i parameters within which public life is lived, and we all know what they are. And those are accepted, but there was always a counterculture within Muslim countries or civilizations which kind of didn't celebrate it, but acknowledged this existence of an underbelly of different, even ideological, sectarian, sexual kind of fringes that were in existence. It's only really with colonialism that it becomes a kind of a crusade against, quote unquote, a crusade against these kind of minorities, where people needed to be placed in very clear boxes. And so it's not even the LGBT individuals, not the community. I would say it's progressives that have a political agenda, which is very much postmodern, relativist. It's very much about deconstructing ideas and categories of the past and waging war against any kind of structure like the church or the mosque, which affirms any kind of real objective truth. And so I think it's progressives, not people necessarily that adhere to the LGBT community as a life choice. Obviously, there's people who are LGBT, a part of that that movement, but I think it's progressives with this kind of guilt of, you know, the kind of the past. It's very much similar to anti-racist movement as well. You'll have people that are Black who've been the victims of generations of prejudice, and then you've got these white middle-class people that take it upon themselves to, you know, to champion the anti-racism project. And I think it's the same thing here. And the only thing about the LGBT lobby is it's very successful. The fact that you have to sign up to the agenda, you have to, you know, clear your kind of your table for anything that they ask for, you know, publicly declare your allegiance to this, is something that no other organization that I know of politically needs, you know, has been able to do. Even the Zionist community has not been able to achieve the almost universal or complete universal success of the LGBT community. That success does not require you to then capitulate to it. And I think it's going to be a very unfortunate civilization where you cannot present a kind of alternative worldview. I think that's probably one of the most important things that I think Muslims need to think about is, you know, I can understand politicians having a degree of, or a prerogative to, you know, work for the greater good and probably just, you know, perhaps, you know, vote in certain ways that individually they shouldn't, but as a political leader, they need to. I think that's a different issue for politicians and public leaders. There's a different dynamics there, which I think our fiqh will accept in certain ways. But for individuals, I don't think that's the case. I think in terms of scholars and individuals, I don't think that is the case at all. So I think, you know, community leaders have a different, you know, sometimes they have certain reasons for taking positions that they take. But the community, LGBT communities, lobbying skills, you know, need to be, you know, commended because they've done something that no other minority has ever been able to do. And the fact that it's a minority and we're a minority doesn't really stand any scrutiny because there's a kind of standard by which minorities are judged, and it's a league table. And obviously, if you're not challenging or you're not going against another minority, you're okay. But if you do, if Muslims are going against the LGBT minority, then it's obvious who's going to lose, because even the Archbishop, you know, he refused to state that, you know, marriage is between a man and a woman. But he was the first person, I think Sheikh Abdul Murad's mentioned this, that he was the first person to condemn Muslims demonstrating about the characterization of the Prophet as a cartoon. And he says, you have to live by the law, that by the values of this society. So he has the guts and you know, the fortitude to talk to Muslims as a minority, but he has no fortitude to talk to the LGBT community, which shows again the success of that community.
So the course is over 4 weeks. So what are we expecting over the kind of 4 sessions? What's the kind of loosely the breakdown? How do you plan to?
I was actually working it today. I was kind of going through, and I'm going to start off with, you know, there's 6 sessions, and each section is broken up into 2. So I'm going into an introduction and gender theory. So I'm going to start off with, you know, the waves of feminism, because LGBT community, transgender rights, and these discussions come out of feminism. So you have 4 major waves of feminism. I'm going to talk about that very quickly as an introduction to feminist approaches to the Quran. So, you know, there's lots of, you know, feminist literature and commentary on the Quran and tafsir of sorts. And that takes up about a whole section, actually, because it's important to understand how females are now saying, look, the Quran does not represent me unless you read it this way. And so verses of the Quran that they find unpalatable or misogynistic or patriarchal or not in keeping with equality. So we have writers like Amina Wadud, for example. I'll be looking at the way that she is now interpreting the Quran, because it represents this dissatisfaction with how the Quran is for a whole section of our community, which is females. And so women that do look at it, obviously they do want to have a look at what the Quran says. And if they think that it's not fair, obviously one of the channels is that they start to interpret the Quran. So I'll be looking at the feminist approaches to the Quran and then assessing that, not telling people what to say to feminists, but just assessing to what degree is this going to have any kind of productive outcome. Not from my perspective, but from the perspective of the same feminist writers that are writing this. So they themselves come to an impasse and they say certain things, and I'm going to look at what they're saying. And so, this is going to save you 20 years of study to, they've done all this, and then they've said that they've reached this kind of end point. What's that end point? I'm going to look at that. And so I'm going to look at that and also look at the way that Muslim scholars look at, certain verses of the Quran from their own perspective, which makes it perfectly acceptable, like the issue of witnesses. Muslim women will say, well, why are, men given, twice inheritance, or why are women given half the right to witness in court? There's very clear and acceptable interpretations of that, which are very modern, in fact, from classical scholars. And so I want to go into some of those kind of discussions as well. So I think this is very important because it comes up when I'm teaching all the time, and I think it was just important to put it in there. And then I'll be looking at hadith as well, in terms of certain hadith that are seen to be misogynistic or patriarchal, very much male-centered. And I'll be highlighting a couple of observations I've made in my study of Islam, which is to do with the reasons why you have certain madhabs and positions that seem to be quite harsh against women. And there are historically positions like that are clearly prejudicial in one way or another. We're looking at the reasons for that by identifying the underlying reason, not the issue, the fiqh reason itself, like why, if you have a child and she's a female, you only slaughter one sheep, and if it's a boy, mashallah, it's two, and you start merriment and all the rest of it. Why is that there? In the Shafi'i and Hanbali school, for example. And so you can discuss the fact that, is it two sheep or one? Yeah, but what's the underlying reason? The underlying reason, I'm going to go into that in detail, because if I explain the underlying reason, which is not to do with proofs, it's to do with methodology, which I've identified in the different schools, you can unpack essentially the whole issue of why hadith have been rejected by most modernist Muslims, most progressive Muslims, most feminist Muslims have rejected essentially the whole corpus of hadith. And this is quite shocking because this is the second source of Islam. Feminist Muslims have accepted the Quran, but with reservation. But the hadith they've rejected. Now think of that. That is where the progressive voices are arriving at. And I think it's important to provide some kind of insight into why hadith are totally relevant to our own situation. And by rejecting them, you're essentially rejecting access to the Quran itself. Because I noticed this when Amina Wadud talks about the Quran, and she finds a hadith that she likes. Oh, she's the first person to quote it. The Prophet ﷺ, Imam Tirmidhi's Shama'il, he never struck a woman, as the reason for why she interprets the verse of the Quran about beating in a certain way. Well, why don't you say this is made up by feminists or whatever? The thing is, there has to be some kind of methodology. And I think Muslims need to kind of start to bring in some methodology. And then, that's the first section, third session. The last three sessions are about gender, sexual orientation, and sexual identity, which I'll be talking about the transgender movement. I'll be talking about same-sex inclinations and the basis for them, and the degree to which I think Islam accepts the inclinations or not as being, given from birth. To what degree can you argue that? In which case, it's an issue of why. why did God allow people? It's a question of theodicy. Why did God allow people to be born with an urge which he would then, subhanahu wa ta'ala, would tell them not to act upon, for example. And then after that, I'll be going into the whole issue of the gender spectrum in Islam itself, in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in theology, in fiqh. It's not just about male and female. We know in classical Islamic theology, you can at least identify 5 typologies of gender orientation or inclination. Leaving aside what we can add to that now, I would say, based upon the study of chromosomes of individuals that have, say, for example, intersex conditions. So that is something that's completely unknown to Muslims, that, a child may be born and they're not male, they're not female, and what they are is actually contested. But there are also situations where people are very clearly have male anatomy or female anatomy, but that their way of interacting, the way of walking and talking, seems to be allied to the opposite of what their physical gender indicators are. Do you understand? So this is, an effeminate man, or or the opposite. And so again, that is sometimes something outside the ability of a person to control. And that's well known. Ibn Qudama talks about it, for example. I'll be talking about, very kind of conservative. Ibn Qudama is extremely conservative. Come on, if you know your in intellectual ears, you will know that, Ibn Qudama is like next to Ibn Taymiyyah in terms of, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah kind of thing. And so he's got this whole discussion about that. And so people need to know that there isn't just 2 genders in Islam. And this is entrenched within the fiqh. The fiqh then gives rise to a very rich civilization, which does provide, some kind of, blurring of the lines of how society operated at the time, and I think it's worth exploring that. Leaving aside the Western discussions and arguments and debates and ideologies about LGBT community and transgender community, all these things, it's worth just taking time out to look at what Islam has codified and accepted in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. And then the last thing I'll be looking at is actually this whole issue of ideology in terms of gender ideology in the context of its opposition to Islam. It's only like weaponizing gender against Islam specifically. The easiest way of looking at that is, sending troops into Afghanistan or any Muslim country to save, like fighting ISIS or wherever it is, to save women. Essentially, it's an ideology. You know what they're there for. But it's much more interesting than that. I think, the whole aspect of, you have nation states, but you also have NGOs, for example, non-governmental organizations that work in Muslim countries. And, people say, well, they're just NGOs and they're just working without any agenda at all. There's some very clear agendas in terms of NGOs, especially in terms of gender. In the Muslim world, it's well documented, that the LGBT community looks into a country and it says, well, this country doesn't really have much of a kind of open LGBT movement. Let's set up a grassroots, quote unquote, grassroots LGBT community there. And they'll find 2 or 3 people. They'll sign them up. They'll give them jobs. They'll set up an organization and they'll channel funds in. They'll set up an office. And then when, obviously, because it's so alien to the culture, the local, authorities and the politicians say, what's this? They will then cry wolf and say, we're being attacked by these conservative Muslims. And, then it hits Twitter storms. And before you know it, there's a reason for imposing sanctions on a country. This is how the West, this is how the ideology works. You have to, in some ways, leave this sense of naivety that we have as Muslims, where NGOs are just something that are, just good people doing good things. In Turkey, for example, in Turkey, I kind of talked about this in the kind of trailer that I did for this course. I was here in the 90s. In the 90s, Muslim women were being attacked, beaten outside universities for wearing headscarves. they'd qualified for medicine and law. They weren't allowed to get in. The highest achieving students in Turkey at the time were people that were graduated from the religious schools, and they were unable to attend university, and they were refused. And, fast forward to last year, the Turkish government took itself out of the Istanbul Convention, which was actually, as it says, was signed in Istanbul, specifically on the topic of combating violence against women, which, because that's what it says, the Turkish government said, yes, let's do this. But within a year, what happened is that was a front for the LGBT community, saying, well, violence against women is also violence against the LGBT community. And so let's set up NGOs in Turkey that now will study the way that the Turkish state is clamping down on the LGBT community. And therefore, America will impose sanctions, the European Council will impose sanctions. This is whole mechanism that comes into being, which means the ideology is here to undermine. I mean, part of the discussion in Turkey is the kind of economic fallout of, so the fallout from those ideological issues is economic. People think, well, it's economics that is dictating, the state of the Turkish economy. That's a small part of what is undermining the economy. It's the ideological attack, which is then, it's how you judge whether a country is going to be open to your demands in terms of, in terms of interest rates and in terms of capital growth. It's quite interesting. It's an interesting thing because it's not just about, whether you should tell your children about same-sex marriage in primary school. Sorry, that's actually one of the main things I will be talking about. Is probably actually, sorry, I haven't even mentioned it up to this time. This is actually one of the most shocking ones, which is the education of young children in sexuality and sexual orientation from primary school, which I think it really does baffle me how that makes any sense. Now, I know primary school teachers. I have great respect for teachers. I have great respect for primary school teachers. I don't know any primary school teacher that I've met, except for one who's a student of mine, who will be able to articulate what these issues are to a child. I will struggle to find a teacher who will teach mathematics and arithmetic and English to my child in a competent way. Do you think it's fair for a teacher to be given the responsibility of conveying extremely complex ideas to a child? And you know how children's minds work. It's just not the time, not the place. But why is it the time and the place? Because the LGBT community says, or the lobbyists of the community say it's time to teach your children about their body and about bullying and about, yes, this type of bullying against people that have different sexual orientations. But at that age, I mean, that's when it becomes, it's clear it's an ideological crusade. It's not to do with anti-bullying legislation. It's not to do with protecting young children from, bullying. It's something completely different. It is adults insisting on their ideology being imposed upon young children. And so if they have problems with Muslims teaching their children about Islam, we should have obviously the same type of problem with these kind of values being taught to our children. Because my son actually went to school for 2 months in the summer, just after summer, and I was going to give him a haircut. And I said, I'll give you a haircut. And he says, no, you can't. And I says, why not? He says, my body. And I said, I didn't say, I thought, like, he doesn't even know what that means. And the person that told him that doesn't know how my son will interpret what that means. And my son, when I asked him what does that mean, he had no idea. And so, it's a very dangerous age to be discussing issues that are way beyond their pay grade as children. And so, as Muslim parents, as Muslims generally, and Muslims do procreate, mashallah, I think you need to know the basics of this topic. You can't just say we don't want our children to learn about it, because they're going to learn about it in some way. You need to be the person that knows about it enough to discuss it with them when they're old enough to understand it. rather you than somebody else, rather you or the imam who's trained in this issue or this topic and knows about it, than a person who has no values. And that's up to them. If people have no values, if they're completely relativist in their ideology, don't believe in God or whatever, that's between them and their own lifestyle. But we do have our own children. We have the right to bring them up in a way that is healthy and is in keeping with thousands of years of civilization. This is all you're asking. You're not as if you're asking to bring them up in some kind of cult. This is civilizationally the way that human beings, not Muslims, human beings have been brought up until 20 years ago. And so is it too much to ask that we stand up for what was a civilizational norm until 20 years ago? And again, it's not even in the world, it's in the West. This is a civilizational norm that's in the West now for the last 20 years. And I don't believe it will remain for long. I think it's, one of the strangest paradoxes that I kind of thought about last night was I was listening to Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray, you'll know who he is. He's a very famous, commentator, right-wing commentator in the UK. He's also gay. I mean, I don't have a problem with that at all. I have a problem with it at the moment that he says that Muslims are procreating in a way that in a way that will mean that the host population, which is Europeans, will not be able to regenerate. And I was thinking, Douglas, do something about it. And so you're kind of left in a situation where he can't do anything about it. Why are you scared about people populating the earth when you, by your actions, refuse to populate the earth? I mean, think about it. Is it ironic? Is it paradoxical? I mean, I think it comes to a point where it's all atrophying and failing. I think the West, in terms of this specific thing, has got it seriously wrong. It refuses to read, it refuses to follow the science, it refuses to think scientifically and in a way that's congruent to the knowledge civilization that it claims to be. And it's just following ideology. And ideology is like Maoist China, it's like the Bolsheviks, it's about the Nazis. All these people followed ideology and refused to follow the science. And the call from Muslims should be follow the science. Simple as that.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of ground that you're hoping to cover. So the first couple of sessions, 3 sessions, are looking at waves of feminism within Islam, feminist tafsirs, Amina Wudud. For people who are viewing, she was the one who stormed up for women to become imam about 10, 20 years ago, and that hit the newspaper.
Famously apparently the first woman imam in the history of Islam. That's how it was billed, and CNN covered it. It was so important.
That's interesting how that's put. And also in terms of rejecting hadith, which I remember from years ago reading a book on by Fatima Mernissi. I think she's one of the popular ones who kind of rejects hadith because they don't kind of fall into their category. In terms of feminism, Sheikh, one thing obviously you're going to deal with it methodologically, looking at usul al-fiqh. 2 questions. By reading and kind of studying them, would you be able to draw up their methodology, even if they don't say they have a methodology? Everyone's working with some sort of usul, right? So number one, if I asked you kind of just summarize their usul for me, what would be the things that would come up for you?
I mean, Fatima Mernissi, I read her first book I read when I was at university in the 90s. I think it was 91 in Glasgow University. I remember Floor Number 7, The Queens of Islam, I think it was. And it was an amazing book. It was a real eye-opener for me. And I think Fatima Mernissi is an exceptionally gifted, or was, she passed away, I think, last year. Allah grant her, protection for her shortcomings. She was respected, to be honest. She was respected. She had this deep love for the Prophet ﷺ, which came out of her books. I mean, it did that struck me really intensely when I read her books. But she also had this mind which could not get beyond the fact there was she called it a patriarchal strand in early amongst the first community, let's just say that. And then she named specific people who basically sold the prophetic teachings for the sake of their own patriarchy. Let's just say that. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ came with that empowering message, okay. But then once he passed away, people just reverted back. And that's her basic thesis. I mean, she is a great scholar. I mean, she was a kind of authority in her own way of the early tabaqat literature, hadith literature. But essentially, I think what the hadith methodology that they have, centers on is that issue. For me, is that issue that the treachery of the Prophet's teachings, then collected in this falsified hadith work that we have left behind. In other words, what we read now is very much not what the Prophet would have said. It's what people wanted him to say, and those people are men. That thesis doesn't work. It doesn't work at all because of the fact that there's so many female voices, especially in the first two generations of hadith collection. It's littered with very important, strong female voices that would not allow that kind of treachery to take place in the first place. And so it's worth kind of dwelling upon that, because lots of Muslims nowadays, modernist Muslims, progressive Muslims, do take this opinion that hadith need to be set aside. And one of the most famous is Fazl Rahman, from passed away now a long time ago, but from the Indian subcontinent, who basically said that the Quran is your basic source of Islam. But even the Quran itself there's a basic Quran, and then there's a Quran which is historical. And so the historical stuff is really about the past. You need to take the general principles and then apply the general principles. And so you kind of left every place that you look at in terms of Muslim revisionism and progressive ideas. You're really talking about people wanting to change Islam into what they would like it to be at this moment in time, based upon their own prejudices and their own inclinations. So the feminist will read it from a feminist perspective, just as the patriarch and the misogynist in the past, quote unquote, would have read it in their perspective. You're doing the same thing. So if you're saying that the early community were misogynistic and they read it and they misrepresented it, you're a feminist now and you're doing exactly the same thing. Or you're part of the LGBT community, you're doing the same thing. Are you not being completely relativist? This is why, over my studies, alhamdulillah, you just touch back to the basic premise, which is that the Quran is preserved. It's in the Arabic language. The Arabic language is preserved. Its lexicon, its language, its dictionary has been preserved. Your ability to understand exactly the force and rhetorical content of the Quran is preserved. We can access that in the way that it almost feels as if it's being revealed. And you cannot then misrepresent it if you have access to the Quran in that way. Because the argument that these people always make is that, well, it's like the Bible, because the Bible's been revised and people now don't take the Bible literally. Well, the Bible is the Bible, and it's and we don't know which language it was in the past. It's definitely not in the language it was in the past now. But the Quran definitely is in the language that it is now, commensurate to what it was in the past, exactly the same. And so there's a complete difference. And this is why, I think Muslims should not shy away from stating what needs to be stated clearly, that this is what we know. Like, this is clearly what's being said. And if you don't like it, then you can't change what the text says. And no scholar, no revisionist, no activist, no politician, no government, no NGO can in any way encroach upon the space of interpreting the Quran outside the rules of its own language. And I think out of all the gray areas that you have in this topic, gender inclination and orientation and the whole spectrum of, even within the Islamic theological literature about human beings and their own inclinations is absolutely clear. It's there. But there is this idea of preservation of the actual sources, which I think for me is the most important thing to kind of focus on, which is the Quran is preserved, its understanding is preserved. And the hadith, we have a methodology through which to decide which hadith are reliable and which are not. And that's all there for everybody to study.
I've just looked at the time. And I realized we're almost up. I had so many questions, actually. Feminism is very interesting. I remember also reading about Bint Shati, and I think she was heralded as one of the first women to write a tafsir or something like that.
She wrote a thematic tafsir.
Yeah. And I remember, Sheikh, speaking to you a number of years ago, where you had also mentioned that this idea is very interesting that the first generation, if they did something, what people like Mernisi and others kind of challenged them, there were voices in the community. And I remember time back you mentioning Imam Zarkashi's work on Sayyidah Aisha, the fact where she did challenge and she was a great authority. And,
yeah, I mean that's the whole argument, isn't it? That book is basically there's no other companion that you can write a book about in which you're saying this is all the places where somebody challenged all the other companions. Who was that? It's a female. That female rode on a camel to fight for justice, whether you say it was justice or not, whether she was right or not. That is the first generation. And at no point and in fact, one of my case studies is about Muslim leadership and whether females can be Muslim leaders, because when Aisha took that army, to Iraq against Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu warda, Sayyidina Ali at no point mentioned to her that the Prophet said that no community would flourish that is led by a woman, which would be the checkmate. If you think about it, if he wanted to stop war, that's it. He would have said, the Prophet said that no community that is led by a woman will be successful. She would have turned back and gone back to her room where the Prophet is buried and stayed there. He didn't, because he knew that wasn't relevant in that context. Essentially, that's why we'll kind of talk about. And so, our tradition is an extremely rich tradition for females, for males, and I would say even for people that have same-sex tendencies, because it does allow you and the ability to reconnect with your creator while at the same time facing up to the specific challenges that you have as an individual. And everybody has different challenges. Sure. And I think, rahmah and mercy and compassion are part and parcel of our faith. And the fact that it's entrenched within our tradition that God is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman al-Arsh istawa. It's the compassionate that is, established upon the throne with his authority. Means that the challenge that you have is a challenge that will not be the basis upon which you will be punished. I mean, no other tradition I can think of has that. The church may teach that now, but it's not part of the original teachings of the Gospels, as you know. And so I think, understanding this topic in detail, dissecting the different discussions in part without saying, what does Islam say about gender? No, let's take it all the issues, which is biological issues, theological issues about ideology and how Islam is being attacked by specific strands of political ideas, and come to the point that you understand where everything is. And that's my idea. My idea is to kind of present the whole topic in a way that, whenever you come back to this topic or discussing this topic, where everything fits. And well, this is a gray area. This is an issue which I shouldn't be meddling with. This is an area where the truth is very clear. And so, just gives you the bearings, like a compass, a compass which allows you to kind of navigate yourself through these issues, inshallah.
Inshallah. Just one final question before we finish is, it's been a difficult decade, obviously, with COVID, and we've seen rapid change generally in the community and society, which otherwise would have maybe have taken decades, but that kind of accelerated within COVID. When it comes to kind of Islam, gender, sexual ethics, identity, and having read all of this and understanding the rapid change, what do you think the next decade which is ahead of us? What kind of lies there for Muslims? What challenges, but also some of the positive things, perhaps?
The pessimism strikes me as being very much called for here. The fact that Muslims are not talking about it, the fact that our kind of national organizations are saying it's not important, the fact that it's part and parcel of an ideological battle against Islam, and it's actually the front, I believe, which is used specifically to break the theological understandings of Islam through femonationalism or whatever it is, means that it doesn't look good. I think this is beyond satanic verses, if you know about what happened in the 80s. This is beyond the fallout from 9/11, where it's all about, are you killing us for no reason, you terrorists? This is about the fact that you are subhuman as Muslim because you don't accept people's rights to do what they want. Why don't you just be quiet? So, this idea about ascribing to British values or French values, French are doing it already. This is going to become much more pointed now. Sorry to be pessimistic, but France is doing it already. They're closing mosques.
Yeah.
In the UK, it'll be very clear that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party will coalesce on this. I believe the SNP in Scotland will also have to make some kind of judgment call, even though it's split based upon the SNP's got its own issue with the feminist movement and the transgender movement at loggerheads, splitting the kind of, not the party apart, but essentially their unity apart. I think it is not looking good. And so if you don't know the topic, you definitely do have problems, because it will affect the way that your children are taught. And you can't be more stark than that. You can't be more blunt than that, because, if it means that children have to be open to these kind of discussions at a very young age, and you don't really have, at a certain point, I believe you won't have the right to veto that or to opt out of that. I think the speeding up of this process of alienating Muslims will, I think, increase. Unless Muslims start to be much more articulate in why they believe that this topic is important for them, and also why they have very important things to say about it. And the way to do that is not to be emotive, is not to be, part and party of this kind of LGBT hate speech movement, which is obviously very, prominent in certain quarters. It's to be articulate and to explain to people exactly why we believe what we believe. Based on biology, based on theology, based on ideology. Simple as that. You know the three things. Everything's speeding up, and I think, attacks on Islam will also speed up as well.
And I suppose the positive is you're doing this course. The
positive is, it's quite interesting because we're doing the course, but we obviously promote the course through different channels, through social media, through social influencers, and through universities. None of those have been possible because we can't really advertise the course normally through Facebook by sponsoring it, because you'll just get closed down. I think you'll get hate speech. Social influencers have just decided it's just too problematic for them. The university ISOCs are actually scared about student unions and whether it'll affect their relationship with the student unions, which makes my point. It didn't strike home to me why I didn't teach this course until it was online, because I was intending to teach this in a university, and it dawned upon me that I wouldn't be able to. And so, if that's not shocking, if it's not shocking that this course can only take place because it's online and because it's under the radar slightly, nothing else will wake you up. I think that's kind of clear for me. It's become clear to me over the last week. So, inshallah, tawfiq. That's what we ask for, inshallah.
So, Islam Engendering Change, when ideology, theology, and biology collide. It's a new course that, we've been discussing it for the past hour, what Sh Ruzwan has up and what he's created for us, essentially. So 6 sessions looking at waves of feminism, and that's kind of leading to issues that we're facing today when it comes to theology and biology. So it's starting next Saturday, and it's taught over 4 sessions. Each session is around 2.5 hours, which is solid over about 10 hours of content. And I believe there's going to be live Q&A. And once you've registered, you still have 90 days to access the course. You can download the PDFs and the slides. Any questions, Sheikh will personally answer them. And there's now even a payment option to split the course into, split the payment into 3 installments. So we're starting next Saturday, 11 to 12:30, and to check out further details and to enroll. And obviously I'll encourage everyone to enroll, especially if you're an imam like me, someone who needs to know these questions, because we're going to have students, but not just in the madrasa, not just general students, because our Sheikh was saying has been entrenched into the education system. Parents, because your children are going to ask you, and they're going to be very young, and you need to understand how to respond to them and the kind of understanding kind of behind that. Muslim teachers who are teaching this stuff are probably be coerced into teaching some of this stuff. How do you understand this? And just generally everyone else, I think, just for us to be a bit more understanding and have be literate actually in this topic, rather than doing the clickbait stuff and then the Quran says this and hadith says this, and just kind of comprehending the entire kind of subject. So I am very interested, Sheikh. Well, I'll get to meet you every week for the next 4 weeks, but also, inshallah, just to kind of sit down and read all of this. And I suppose you've saved a lot of time for a lot of people like me who are thinking, okay, what book shall we read and where do we start from? And it's a fantastic starting point for someone like me. And I've just kind of ordered a few books already, but just to get the whole comprehensive thing, and then, carry on reading from there, really, actually. So you've done a lot of work for us. So jazakumullah khair wa ahsanul jaza. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you, give you himma and strength to others, so they can understand what the challenging topics are and how our strong tradition, when articulated beautifully, is able to respond to these challenges. So jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Anything do you want to kind of finish on before we end?
No, inshallah, just du'as, and it's taken a long time. I mean, I read Fatima Mernis's in the early 90s, so it's, I don't know, I'll do the mathematics here, but I read one of her books this last year again, just to refresh all her ideas, and so it's been a long time these ideas have been in my mind, and it's one of these things that there's lots of topics I have in my mind, but this was one that I just felt, is this so pertinent to the day and age we're living in?
Absolutely.
Because people say follow the science, and I'm seeing, I spoke to an endocrinologist, a consultant endocrinologist just 2 hours ago, and he was saying the same thing, because they're the people that intervene when somebody wants to change their gender. Okay. And he was saying people are doing things that they do not know what they're doing. Young people are being coaxed into taking decisions that they have no ability to do because of their maturity levels. And this is why, in fact, there's a consultation about, same-sex gender change. The consultation has actually been extended because of the presentation from the endocrinologist community, because of the fears that they have over the red legislation, meaning that they were saying that the science does not follow what you're doing. And so it is scary if professionals in the NHS have to then put the brakes on legislation. I just think if Muslims aren't talking about this at this moment in time, then I think they've missed the boat in terms of priorities. So inshallah, du'as, inshallah, look forward to seeing everybody there. Plenty of time to interact, live Q&A, 2.5 hours or whatever it is. I hope to be exhausted in that session, inshallah, because obviously people that listen to it will agree or disagree. The idea for me is if you join and you disagree with everything, you've got a whole session to rant and let it all off, because I'm just going to present what my 24 or 5 years of understanding of this topic is. That should speed up for you a lot of what you're looking for, even if you disagree with everything I'm saying. And that's the way to take things, inshallah. It's a good way of doing it, inshallah. So jazakallah khair for hosting. the event, and inshallah hope to see everybody at the course, inshallah.